1776, the year that changed the world. The year was 1776, and the world was trembling on the edge of a new age. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a chain of colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, bustling with farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, sailors, and craftsmen. They lived their daily lives under the shadow of the British Empire, the most powerful force on Earth. But in that single year, a spark was lit that grew into a fire no army could put out. The old world of monarchs and subjects was challenged by an idea so daring, so radical, that it reshaped the course of history. That idea was independence. To understand 1776, we have to step back and feel the world as it was then. The 13 colonies were not yet a nation. They were a patchwork of societies, each with its own culture and economy. Massachusetts was fiercely Puritan, with towns driven by church and community. Virginia was rich with plantations and tobacco fields. Pennsylvania thrived with Quakers and immigrants from all across Europe. What united them was not uniformity, but a growing frustration. They were taxed by a parliament in London where they had no voice. They were restricted in trade, their ships subject to inspection, their markets shaped by imperial decree. British soldiers roamed their streets, reminding them daily of who was in charge. The colonies had already begun to push back. A year earlier, in 1775, the first shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. Farmers with muskets had faced British regulars, and the war had begun in earnest. Bunker Hill soon followed. A bloody clash outside Boston where British troops won the ground but lost so many men that victory felt hollow. George Washington had been chosen as commander of the Continental Army. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with a quiet dignity that inspired confidence. But his army was little more than a collection of militias, poorly supplied, often untrained, and perpetually short on money. Still, the idea of liberty was alive, and it carried them through. Then came January of 1776. Into this fragile and uncertain moment came a pamphlet that would electrify the colonies. It was called Common Sense, written by a man named Thomas Paine. Paine was not a wealthy aristocrat or a polished politician. He was an immigrant from England with a sharp mind and a sharper pen. He wrote in plain language that everyone could understand, not in the lofty phrases of lawyers and scholars. His words cut straight to the heart of the matter. He argued that it made no sense for an island to rule a continent. He insisted that monarchy was a flawed and corrupt system, that kings were not chosen by God, but were simply men who had seized power. Most importantly, he declared that the time for independence had come. Common Sense spread like wildfire. Over 100,000 copies were sold in just a few months, an astronomical number for that time. People read it aloud in taverns, in churches, on street corners. Farmers, merchants, sailors, and artisans all heard Paine's words and felt a spark ignite. Suddenly, the idea of independence was no longer a whisper spoken in secret corners. It was a call shouted across the land. As spring turned to summer, the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia to debate the path forward. The Pennsylvania State House, now called Independence Hall, became the center of history. Inside those walls, 56 delegates from the colonies gathered to decide the fate of their future. The air was thick with heat and tension. Some delegates, like John Adams of Massachusetts, were fiery in their support for independence. Adams argued with relentless passion that the colonies had no choice but to break free. Benjamin Franklin, older and wiser, offered wit and wisdom, reminding the men that unity was essential. Others, however, feared the consequences. They worried that rebellion against Britain would lead only to destruction. The responsibility of drafting the Declaration of Independence fell to Thomas Jefferson, a tall and quiet Virginian with a gift for words. In his rented room on Market Street, Jefferson dipped his quill into ink and began to write. He wrote not only for his fellow delegates, but for the world. He declared that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. These words were not just revolutionary, they were dangerous. If the revolution failed, every man who signed the Declaration would be branded a traitor and executed. Yet Jefferson wrote, and when the delegates debated and revised his words, they still carried the spirit of freedom. On July 2nd, 1776, the Congress voted in favor of independence. On July 4th, they approved Jefferson's Declaration. Bells rang out in Philadelphia. Crowds gathered to hear the words read aloud. Imagine standing in that crowd, hearing the words for the first time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The people cheered, they wept, they felt fear and excitement all at once. A new nation had been born in defiance of the greatest empire on earth. But celebration was short-lived. Britain was not about to let its colonies walk away. That summer, the largest fleet the world had ever seen up to that time appeared in New York Harbor. Hundreds of ships filled the waters, carrying tens of thousands of British soldiers and sailors, as well as Hessian mercenaries from Germany. It was an overwhelming display of power. Washington's army was outnumbered and outgunned. At the Battle of Brooklyn in August, the Americans suffered a crushing defeat. Washington barely saved his army with a daring nighttime retreat across the East River, slipping away under the cover of darkness. Had the British discovered them, the war might have ended then and there. Through the fall, the defeats piled up. The British pushed Washington's forces back through New York and into New Jersey. The Continental Army shrank as enlistments ended and men deserted. Supplies ran low. Spirits sank. By December, many believed the revolution was doomed. Even Washington admitted privately that the situation was desperate. But 1776 was a year of resilience. On Christmas night, Washington made a bold move. He led his men across the icy Delaware River in the dead of night. The crossing was brutal. The river was filled with chunks of ice. The wind was merciless, and the soldiers were exhausted, yet they pushed on. At dawn, they struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The surprise was complete. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 soldiers while losing only a handful of their own. A week later, Washington followed up with another victory at Princeton. These battles were small in scale, but enormous in impact. They breathed life back into the Revolution. They proved that the Americans could fight and win. While the battles raged, ordinary people carried the burden of revolution in their own ways. Farmers left their fields to fight, leaving families to tend the land alone. Women like Abigail Adams managed farms, businesses, and even political correspondence while their husbands were away. Some women, like Molly Pitcher, even took up arms in the heat of battle. Children grew up surrounded by the sound of muskets and the fear of raids. Families were torn apart as loyalties divided brothers and neighbors. Some remained loyal to Britain, believing rebellion was madness. Others risked everything for liberty. The year 1776 was not a straight march to freedom. It was a year of ups and downs, of hope and despair, of victories and defeats. At any moment, it could have all collapsed. That is what makes it so remarkable. Against overwhelming odds, ordinary people chose to fight for something larger than themselves. They chose to believe in a future that did not yet exist. As the year closed, the colonies had declared their independence, survived crushing defeats, and pulled off daring victories. The war was far from over. In fact, the hardest years still lay ahead, but the foundation was set. The Declaration had been written, signed, and sent into the world. The people had proven their willingness to bleed for the cause, and the idea of America, fragile and uncertain though it was, had been born. Now, nearly 250 years later, we look back on 1776 not as a distant story, but as a living lesson. It is easy to believe that independence was inevitable, that freedom was guaranteed, but, in truth, it was anything but certain. Every step carried risk. Every decision carried fear. Every victory was fragile. The men and women of 1776 were not superheroes. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. That is why their story still matters. It reminds us that freedom is not handed down like a gift. It is earned through courage, through sacrifice, and through determination. It is defended not only on battlefields, but in debates, in pamphlets, in quiet acts of resistance, and in bold declarations of principle. So, as we approach the 250th anniversary of that monumental year, let us not treat it as dusty history. Let us treat it as a challenge to carry forward the spirit of 1776. A challenge to remember that liberty is fragile and must be guarded. A challenge to live as if those words Jefferson wrote are still fresh on the parchment. That all men are created equal, that governments exist only by the consent of the governed, that freedom is worth the risk. And that is the story of 1776, the year that changed everything.